Hey everyone, welcome back to the Balanced Lens, where we discuss faith, culture, and politics from a Christian perspective. We've been talking through the Bill of Rights as we celebrate America 250, and frankly, I've been blown away digging deep through the first 10 amendments of the Constitution and understanding the great freedom that we enjoy here in America and how we contrast that to different countries around the world. Continue on what we've been talking about in the past few episodes. We're going through the amendments 6 through 10 today. And the Sixth Amendment is interesting. What is that about? And how is that different in the United States compared to other countries around the world?
So the Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury, the right to be informed of the charges against you, the right to confront witnesses, the right to compel favorable witnesses to testify, and the right to the assistance of counsel. One of the landmark rulings in 1963, Gideon versus Wainwright, the Supreme Court held that the right to counsel must be extended to even impoverished defendants in state criminal proceedings. So that is the case that gave rise to the public defender system. The principle was that if you cannot afford a lawyer, the state must provide one. Because if you think about it, the Sixth Amendment guarantee is meaningless if only the wealthy can afford a lawyer to enforce it. So let's contrast this with in Saudi Arabia. So in Saudi Arabia, when defendants were interviewed by Human Rights Watch, they reported that in many cases, they met their lawyers for the first time at trial. The judges in that country is appointed by the king, and it's overseen by the Supreme Judicial Council, whose chairman is also the justice minister, reporting to the monarchy. So this arrangement makes it impossible to have judicial independence, right? Women's testimony in that country is generally weighted at half the value of a man's testimony under the judicial interpretation of Sharia law. The testimony of non-observant Sunni Muslims can be disregarded. So that's Saudi Arabia. If you look at China, defense lawyers in politically sensitive cases have been disbarred, detained, or just disappeared. The conviction rate, and this is interesting, the conviction rate in Chinese courts exceeds 99, a figure that in an adversarial legal system would suggest that it's not justice, it's a predetermined outcome, because they have a lot of performance metrics that, if you have a higher conviction rate, it means you're not doing your job. If you're having a lower conviction rate, you're not doing a good enough job with your conviction process. Anyway, the trial is, so that's the issue in China. So if you go to Russia, the concept of an independent judiciary has been completely hollowed out at this point. Cases involving political dissenters regularly result in convictions that observers consistently describe as predetermined. So the Sixth Amendment, imagines a criminal justice system in which the accused is a fully legal person entitled to fight back against the power of the state with equal procedural weapons. Right? That imagination of the Sixth Amendment can still be argued that it's imperfectly realized even in the United States. But that is our measuring standard, right? Whereas in some of these other places, that standard does not even exist to measure against.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because even in democratic countries such as the UK, Canada, many European countries, there's no strong constitutional provision, right, that we have in the United States, like the Sixth Amendment. There are statutes, there are human rights treaties, there are parliamentary rulings, but nothing as distinctive as the U.S. Constitution, where these protections are explicitly guaranteed for those living in the U.S., and they're enforceable, the government, through our courts. I know what's fascinating about this amendment, there's different features to this, kind of like you said, right? There are rights that the accused have to a fast and public trial. They must be clearly told what crime they're being charged with. They must be allowed to face and question witnesses against them. They must be allowed to bring in their own witnesses and have a lawyer to defend them. And so these rules all exist to ensure that government cannot lock someone up or, railroad them through an unfair process. So it's about giving real people the chance to defend themselves in a courtroom, as opposed to being behind closed doors somewhere. Moving on to the Seventh Amendment. The Seventh Amendment reads like this: in suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. What does that mean, and why is this all important?
I know this $20 sticks out, so I did do a quick research on why $20. $20 in 1791 is equivalent to, say, about $4,000 today if you were to compare the value of gold, which everything was pegged against, from then versus now. So it's not literally $20 today, but that's how the amendment reads. So the idea here is the right to have a jury of peers that determine civil disputes, not just a judge, and certainly not a government official. It basically reflects, this idea basically reflects a founder's deep suspicion of concentrated power. You can trust, like when there are 12 ordinary citizens that are sitting between the state and the individual who is now undergoing trial, it's a check on judicial and government power. And it's distinctly an Anglo-American legal tradition. Like most civil law countries, if you think of Germany, France, Japan, do not use juries in civil cases. Of course, in China, if you think of China, Russia, Saudi, UAE, civil disputes are adjudicated by judges appointed or accountable to the state, with no citizenry check on the process. So this is what makes the Seventh Amendment unique in the U.S.
And so the Seventh Amendment is really interesting, and it's fascinating, and it's actually mind-blowing because, like you mentioned, most countries do not guarantee this constitutional right to a civil trial jury like the United States does. And you mentioned some countries, and I didn't realize that Germany, France, Japan, China, South Korea, Brazil, and the Netherlands generally resolve civil lawsuits through professional judges rather than juries. So that's kind of mind blowing to me. I thought every country in the world had a jury system, but even countries like with strong legal systems like Canada, Australia, and the UK, civil jury trial only exists in limited categories of cases and are relatively uncommon. That's even really mind blowing to me. Like I'm learning so much digging through the laws of other countries, and you begin to appreciate right these Bill of Rights so much more. And so we are guaranteed the right to a jury trial in civil cases. And even other G7 countries don't have strong protections like the US has. So, really fascinating. Now, the Eighth Amendment, just as powerful and important to our judicial system, says that excessive bail should not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. What does that mean?
It's also a distinctive trait, right? It goes back to some of the concerns that our founding fathers and the people who debated had at the time. One interesting ruling from the Supreme Court was Trope versus Jules in 1958. It held that the Eighth Amendment must be interpreted according to evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. So that phrase has driven a lot of constitutional litigation over capital punishment, over prison conditions, over the treatment of juvenile offenders. All these issues are debated in this country, and they're litigated because of that amendment, right? So let's contrast this with other countries, just so people have context. In Saudi Arabia, if you look at their legal system, flogging is permitted as a judicial sentence, and that was happening until, like, say, 2020. The law permits amputation of hands or feet for robbery. In 2025, Saudi Arabia broke its own record for executions for the second consecutive year with at least 347 executions. Executions are authorized for offenses including like apostasy, sorcery, adultery. So in 2018, the UN panel found that Saudi Arabia had been systematically using anti-terror laws to justify torture in their country. If you look at China, the use of death penalty is considered a state secret. But credible estimates by human rights organizations put the annual number of executions in the thousands, which is more than all the other nations combined. So, and then one other controversial thing is organ harvesting from executed prisoners have also been documented by independent researchers in China. So the Eighth Amendment, if you think about how it's phrased and why it exists, it's grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition that human beings, even those who have done terrible things, retain certain dignity, right? So if you read Proverbs chapter 12, verse 10, it tells us that even a righteous man considers the life of an animal. So how much more the life of a human being, no matter how fallen they are. So this amendment, just to be clear, does not say that punishment is wrong, but it says that you cannot degrade a human being who is created in God's image.
Yeah, and the founders added this because they had seen the British government use cruel punishments and unfair fines to punish political opponents. And so the Eighth Amendment makes sure that punishment stays fair and humane. And it's about treating even broken people with basic dignity, even when they've trespassed against the law. And you talked about these countries like Saudi and Iran and North Korea, right? And obviously, you expect the worst possible judicial system in these countries. Actually, Saudi kind of surprised me because they're a very wealthy economy. But even in countries like the UK and Canada and Australia, they protect individuals from abusive judicial treatment, not through an explicit constitutional guarantee, but through a series of statutes and common law and human rights and parliamentary power that can really be changed quickly as opposed to being encoded into the Constitution like in the US. So the freedom that we have here, the protection from excessive bail and excessive punishment and excessive fines is encoded deeply into the value system, whereas in other countries, they're not as entrenched. Moving on to the Ninth Amendment, really interesting amendment here. Very unique. It states this: the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. What does that mean? And why is that important?
And this amendment is Madison's answer to its own objection that he raised earlier, right? He had worried that listing rights would imply that the rights that were not listed does not exist. So the Ninth Amendment says no, the list is not exhaustive. The people have rights beyond what is written here, and the Constitution acknowledges its own incompleteness. So, and this is actually theologically and philosophically significant because it reflects that the natural law theory that rights exist in the moral order prior to and independent of the government's decision to recognize them. So, like if you look at Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, it describes the law written on the hearts of those who don't have the written law. So the Ninth Amendment is a constitutional expression of that same type of conviction that is in the Bible, that human dignity generates rights that no document can fully enumerate. Right? So if you look at authoritarian systems, there is no Ninth Amendment equivalent at all. The rights are what the states decide to grant the people. Nothing exists beyond the written permission of the government. This is the contrast. And it's not just purely just a legal difference, right? It's a fundamental difference that we see that distinguishes the U.S. Constitution from other parts of the world.
Yeah, and this is very unique, right? This is essentially, I think we're the only country that says that rights not enumerated in the Constitution still belong to the people. And what's fascinating is that in many countries, they believe the state is the grantor of rights. We believe as Christians in the Judeo-Christian worldview that God has given us rights apart from any government, apart from the king. And so the Ninth Amendment seeks to essentially codify that into the Constitution. Now, what's fascinating here, as you mentioned, other well-developed Western powers, countries like the UK, France, Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, they don't have a provision directly analogous to the Ninth Amendment. Some courts in countries like the UK and Canada and Australia, they protect individuals, but these protections are very broad. They're interpreted through law and judicial interpretation, but they're not explicitly baked into the Constitution. And so this is distinctive, very unique to America, unseen in any other government in the world. But like you said, it's founded on this theological idea that our rights are from God. They're not granted from the state. And so very big difference in how you approach the philosophy of political law. And that's important to understand if you're someone who loves American freedom and law and who really has a knack for political philosophy. So bridging onto that is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What does this mean, and how is this applicable to our life today?
This amendment is actually the constitutional anchor of the American federalism, right? The federal government only has the powers that the Constitution specifically grants it. Everything else belongs to the states or to the people directly. And this decentralization of power was intentional and it was structural, and it's actually one of the most distinctive features of the American system. In contrast, if you look at China, power flows entirely from the Communist Party, which controls the state, the military, and the courts. There is no meaningful division of authority between the central and regional government that operates independently of the party control in China. In Russia, Putin has systematically dismantled regional autonomy, replacing elected governors with he's appointed loyalists in those positions. In Saudi Arabia, UAE, other parts of this autocratic governments, power is concentrated in the hereditary rulers. No structural check from any subsidiary or peer government structures. So the 10th Amendment, it matters because it distributes power. And the idea is that the distributed power is harder to abuse. When the authority is dispersed across 50 different states, multiple layers of government, right? Executive, judicial, and the legislative, and you have the media as well. It's very, very difficult for one faction to capture total control, right? And this was the founding fathers' genius. It remains to this day and on its best days the pure genius of the American system. It's absolutely wonderful, and nothing can come close to it, right? It's just you can hear everything. Like, just look at the Iran war today. There are factions within our government. There are factions within the states, right? There is a media that you'll see actively giving you multiple views of what's happening in Iran. Nobody's giving you a rosy picture, right? You get, if you are careful enough to look at everywhere, you can hear all the positives and all the negatives. You go to some of these countries when they are in conflict or whenever whatever is happening, you will only hear one side of the story. You will never hear another side of the story. So if in the US they want to stop this war, Congress can act and the war has to stop. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about America, if you don't live here, it's this chaotic diversity of views. There are some people believe that the family structure is a man and a woman. There are some people believe you can marry a cat. But we make it work in America because of federalism, right? We have states where marriage laws are widely different. We have states where laws about, how you run a school or how you operate a business are vastly different. And it works because federalism is a concept broadly entrenched into our Constitution. We believe rights not enumerated by the Constitution expressly for the federal government are now divulged to the states. Now, there are many unitary forms of government in the world. Many nations don't have a federalist system. And even the nations that do, you think about federalistic countries like Canada or Australia, India, they divide powers between national and regional governments, but they don't have a constitutional clause equivalent to the 10th Amendment expressly reserving undelegated power to the states and to the people. And so federalism is a beautiful thing because it allows so many views in the United States and so many political philosophies to exist all under a single branch of the United States government, protected by states' rights in the system of federalism. And, you could read textbooks on this and still not fully understand the wide, expansive freedom guaranteed and protected by federalism. And so it is really a beautiful concept. And as I've grown older, I've come to appreciate it more. You have states that are more conservative, take Tennessee or Texas. Then you have states like California, right? They have very liberal social laws, and yet we all get along, right? And why is that? It's because federalism preserves the rights of states to enact laws and allows the freedom of people to be preserved in this context of the American Constitution. Now, as we celebrate America 250, we celebrate, 250 years of independence. How do we summarize the core framework of freedom in America? How do we look at the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution? And what are some overarching themes that we can glean from this? Because we've had several episodes on this. I'm so glad we did this because I've learned so much. I've come to appreciate the uniqueness of the American system. But what are some themes that we could wrap up with from all these important documents, our government?
So the Declaration of Independence alongside our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, like at its deepest level, we shouldn't think of it as purely just legal documents. It's really fundamentally a moral document, an expression of the conviction about what human beings are and what they are worth. So our founders drew on multiple intellectual traditions. There was the Enlightenment political philosophy, the English common law, classical republicanism. They drew also consciously and explicitly on a Judeo-Christian understanding of human nature. So, like, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it clearly talks about the rights endowed by their creator, right? That language is very, very explicit that if our rights come from God, then no government can legitimately take them away. The government's role is not to create rights, but to protect them, right? That's the fundamental. So if we go back all the way to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it tells us that God created human beings in his own image, the imago Dei, not some human beings, every human being. And that theological claim has enormous implications politically. If every person, regardless of race, religion, wealth, status, whatever, gender, if they bear the image of the divine, then every person possesses an inherent dignity that must be respected. Every person, right? The Fourth Amendment's protection of our home from warrantless intrusion is a way of saying our private life matters. We are not merely a subject of the state's inspection. The Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination is a way of saying that we are not required to destroy ourselves at the state's command. There are limits to what power can demand of a person. The Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel punishment is a way of saying even the guilty retain their humanity. Even in judgment, we must not treat a person as something less than human. The Ninth Amendment's acknowledgement of enumerated rights is a way of saying that human beings are not fully knowable by any legal text, that the depth of human dignity exceeds any constitutional capacity to describe it and enumerate it. So as we look at this, right, 250 years ago, this country did something no nation had quite done before. It took a written constitution, added to it a list of things, the Bill of Rights that the government simply could not do to the people, and made those limits supreme law of this land. And so as we mark America at 250, we are not in any way celebrating a perfect system. We are recognizing an imperfect system that is built on a perfect aspiration, that every human being, by virtue of being human, is entitled to be treated with dignity before the law, that the government must justify its power, and the individual is not merely a subject of the state, right? So as we think through all the different elements that we heard, the question is not whether the Constitution and the Bill of Rights has served this nation well. History clearly tells us that it has and it hasn't sometimes, and like it goes back and forth, right? The question is for every generation is if we will take it seriously enough to live by it fully. Like we have to be able to live fully by it, not just by the rights that we feel and we find convenient to protect. So that's how I would summarize this entire, like, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and the Declaration, how I think about America at 250, right? Every generation has their own responsibility to carry it forward and work towards the aspirations that has been set, right? It's a standard that has been set that we have to live up to, and it's a challenge for every generation to do it.
Yeah, and we've contrasted our frame of government with many countries around the world. And I hope as you're listening to this episode, you've come to appreciate how vastly different we are, even from our peer neighbors, our G7 countries, and how unique the American system of law and government is. The Bill of Rights says that we're endowed by our creator, right? Not through the king, our rights. It says that we're uniquely individualistic, that they are judicially enforceable against the government and born from a distrust of power, specifically British colonial power. And this is a contrast with many parliamentary or post-colonial systems where rights were easily limited or granted by legislators. And so we have this whole framework of documents and debates that made America's founding revolutionary. We live in a nation built on ideas of rights, consent, and rights that are limited only by our own incursion into how we affect people adversely. We're not limited by government. We're not limited by our own free will. We're limited strictly on when we begin to encroach on the freedoms of someone else. And so that's unique to the American context. And so as we celebrate America 250, let's remember, and really renew that spirit. It's a country built on understanding that God is the author and the provider of our rights. And so our system of government is derived from that. And it's beautiful to see, even after 250 years as a nation, that we're flourishing based on these principles. Once again, we hope you've enjoyed listening to our episode. Like or drop a comment below. We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks everyone for joining.